The personal boundary is a very unique and is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of an individual's psychology because it's the container that holds everything else. Our boundary is an invisible fence around us that protects and budgets all of our internal resources. Some examples of our internal resources inside our boundary are our human rights, like our right to privacy, as well as our freedom, freedom of religion, freedom to have our own opinions and attitudes. The psychiatrist Viktor Frankl once said, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." He said that as a Jewish prisoner of war at Auschwitz during the Holocaust. Auschwitz was probably the worst place on earth he could have found himself at the time. Our morals and ethics reside inside our boundary, so our boundary provides a measurement of our character, a measurement that directly correlates with the health of our boundary. Self-discipline, decision-making power, and our intellect are inside our boundary. Our positive emotional energy in all its forms, such as confidence, happiness, gratitude, etc., are all inside our boundary. For the sake of simplicity, we'll lump all forms together and call it self-esteem. Our personal boundary is what gives us strength in a psychological sense. It's like a shield, and it acts as our first line of defense against stress. A hallmark of individuals with healthy boundaries are that they are able to say no when they have to, and able to hear no without being affected in such a way that would cause depletion of any of their internal resources. This invisible fence that surrounds us, that we call our personal boundary, is fortified by our preferences in life, the things we say yes to and the things we say no to. These preferences are all binary, meaning yes or no, not maybe. This can include the things we like and the things we don't like, the things we'll tolerate and the things we won't tolerate, etc. The function of our boundary is metaphorical to the function of a cell membrane. When a cell membrane is healthy, it allows nutrients in, but it keeps toxins out, and it excretes waste. As we move along, the first thing I want to talk about is control. Our personal boundary clearly marks and delineates our limits, or everything residing inside our boundary. We have 100% control over everything inside our boundary. Conversely, we have 0% control over everything outside our boundary. Now that could include the weather, the economy, or other people with boundaries of their own. When we talk about problems, every problem, no matter the nature of the problem, as well as the solution to every problem, includes a portion that falls within our control or inside our boundary, as well as a portion that falls outside our control or outside our boundary. For individuals to be extremely effective in problem solving, they need to develop healthy, mature, high-character personal boundaries. Individuals with healthy boundaries know their limits and thus can clearly see in any problem what they can control and what they can't. Viewed in this light, the very first step in solving any problem, no matter what the nature of the problem might be, becomes simple. Not easy necessarily, but simple. Let go of what you don't control and focus on the things you do control. Now, to give an example from my own life, if I had a magic wand and I could wave it and solve just one huge world problem, I would wave it and end child abuse and neglect. To break this problem down, first, the big picture problem of child abuse and neglect resides way outside my boundary. And since I don't have a magic wand, I have no control over the big picture problem. So I have to let that part of the problem go and focus on the things I can control. Mother Teresa once said, "If you want to change the world, go home and love your family." Now, I can do that. I can make a deliberate decision to work on my own self-discipline and better manage my time in such a way that allows me to expand my intellect. When I expand my intellect, I could write a book, I could start a podcast, I can help raise awareness in such a way that hopefully contributes in a meaningful way to the overall solution to the big picture problem. Now, there are times, however, that we all wish we could control things outside our boundary. And when we do, we feel emotional pain as a result. So as we move along, the operative word now becomes suffering. We suffer when we burn our psychological fuel on things we don't control. The term suffering I describe here as we progress is distinct from grieving. Grieving is extremely painful, but is a normal and healthy process as one heals emotionally from a loss, typically of a loved one. We suffer through holes in our boundary when we have a gap in this invisible fence that surrounds us. These holes are created in our boundary by the difficulty or inability to say no or to hear no in a certain area of our life, or in an area of our life where we try to control something outside our boundary. And we all do this at times. No one has a perfect boundary. An example of suffering is when we're stuck in rush hour traffic and in a hurry to get somewhere. When we tailgate, yell, cuss, give others the middle finger, and all that kind of fun stuff, we might not realize what's happening at the time, but we're suffering. We're burning our emotional energy on the uncontrollable. It's like our boundary is a tank of gasoline, and our positive emotional energy is the gasoline. And when we're suffering, it's just pouring out of us. The tip-off to knowing if we're suffering is if we're using vague language like the word should, as in, I just gave a great presentation. This client should buy from me. I sure hope he does. If he doesn't, I might not make quota. And if I don't make quota, I can't go on vacation. And if I can't take my girlfriend on vacation, she might break up with me. If that happens, my life would fall apart. In this example, I now have a negative thought loop going on where one negative thought has spiraled out of control. Conversely, a response reflecting healthy boundaries would be, I just gave a great presentation. It would be a nice bonus if this client buys from me. Hopefully he will. If not, I'll help the next client. Since I can't control what this client does from this point forward, I have to focus on what I can control, which is my attitude, my work ethic, my self-discipline, and to be coachable so as to improve every way I can and ultimately make a lot more calls so I have the opportunity to close more deals rather than to waste time suffering over something I can't control. Holes in our boundary give other people quick and easy access to all of our internal resources. We've heard the phrase, this person is pushing my buttons. What exactly does that mean? Is that a button on our shirt? No. The button referenced here is a hole in our boundary, an area of our life where we have difficulty saying no or hearing no, an area of our life where we say the word should. Big holes in our boundary allow other people to reach in and take our stuff. It's like we have our own personal Fort Knox inside us, but we left the windows open. When people push our buttons through holes in our boundary, they typically are trying to evoke some sort of a negative emotional response. When this happens, we do exactly what they want us to do without them having to ask. This is how manipulation works. Another example is we have all had people tell us how we should feel or who we should hate, etc. These people are trying to reach into our boundary through a hole and take over our decision-making power. There are numerous other examples. The way to fix holes in our boundary is simple. We say no. Saying no is known in the self-help literature as setting a boundary. Saying no prevents suffering, increases self-esteem, and builds healthy boundaries in the process. As we move along, the last section I want to cover is identity. In the literature, boundaries are often described as where we end and others begin. The psychiatrist M. Scott Peck wrote, "Each of us is unique, and our uniqueness makes of each of us an I entity. We all have a separate identity." Our personal boundary, and thus our preferences in our lives, the things we say yes to and the things we say no to, are what define our identity. Thus far, I've used a circle to give a visual explanation of the personal boundary and boundary function. When a person has a boundary that's full of holes, their identity can come into question. That is to say, their boundary would be vague in shape. If I were to draw a circle now with really wide gaps in it, we'd have difficulty knowing what it was. It could be a square for all we know. This is like our identity. If an individual has really big holes in their boundary where they don't have preferences in their life or that they suffer out of, then by default, they don't have a very well-defined identity. And just an FYI, prior to a lot of hard personal development work on myself and specifically on my own boundaries, I've been this person I'm about to describe earlier in my own life. Now, we all know someone who doesn't have preferences. People who say things like, "I don't care where we go eat. It doesn't matter what we watch on television. Any food's okay with me. I'll wear whatever shirt you want me to wear," or so on. This person doesn't have a very well-defined identity that they're presenting to others or that they are living in themselves. Now, after a lot of hard work on myself and on my own boundaries, and since it's baseball season, I like to tell people I'm the kind of guy who gives a hard no to the Chicago Cubs and a yes to the St. Louis Cardinals. I don't want to offend anybody, but I tend to say no to jazz music in my life and yes to rock. I give another hard no to the news. Network makes absolutely no difference. And if it's not a ball game that I have interest in, pretty much television in general, and yes to something that keeps me either in a positive headspace or expands my intellect, whether it's a book, a podcast, a YouTube video, etc. So what that makes me is a Cubs hating, Cardinals loving, jazz music hating, old school headbanger still living in the 80s, aspiring psychotherapist that reads too much psychology and doesn't watch television. Now, with all that being said, don't you feel like you know me just a little bit better? Don't you have a little bit better idea about what my identity is just based off a few superficial preferences? Our preferences are what define our identity. And without preferences, it's difficult to know, who a person really is. So who is this? It's impossible to know. If instead I say no to the Cubs, no to jazz music, no to the news, and so on and so forth, and I have a solid set of preferences in every area of my life, every detail, yes to this, no to this, yes to this, no to this, this establishes my identity, and it becomes, yeah, this is exactly who I am. Now, going back to problem solving just for a second, if we find ourselves using vague language like, "I'm overwhelmed," or "I just can't seem to put my finger on what's wrong," this indicates a boundary problem within the problem. Because when we have a solid identity, we have a solid boundary, and nothing inside it is vague. And that makes everything outside our boundary not vague either. So I'll conclude with this. When we develop healthy, mature, high-character personal boundaries, we know our limits, We know exactly who we are. We become much more effective at problem solving. We suffer a lot less, so we're a lot happier. And by default, we have a pretty good baseline of mental health. I hope everyone found this informative. And lastly, always remember, healthy boundaries make good fences, and good fences make good neighbors. Thank you.